Hello and welcome to the final installment of my Yumeko Jabami series. I got most of the way through editing this and realized I forgot to film an intro, so instead of that, here's some clips of the finished costume, and I don't know about you, but I'm ready to get on with this, so let's just get started. So I already stitched the lining into the facing. I'm not sure where that footage went, but that's where we are right now. The lining seam allowance gets cross-stitched to the canvas, which you can't see, and then the seam line gets basted all the way through to the front of the jacket, which you can see. The lining gets an ease pleat in the shoulder area, and typically that's a little higher than I have it here, but I wanted to match up my pleat with the dart in the other layers. Now I'm doing a basting stitch parallel to the facing lining seam from the hem up to the shoulder. From the right side of the jacket, run a basting stitch starting near the arm's eye, running around the arm's eye and down the side of the jacket. By this point, you should have also stitched the center back seam of your outer fabric. This gets trimmed down to an inch seam allowance for alterability in the future. The lining has also been stitched at center back, but has an ease pleat of 1 inch starting around the waist. This is to accommodate the movement of the back and shoulders. Match up the center back seams on the fashion layer and the lining layer, and pin, then baste into place. Repeat for the side back seams, smoothing the layers so they lay together without any rippling. Once you've got all the seams pinned together, then make a large basting stitch along where the seams have been pinned. Flip the jacket so you're looking at the right side, and baste around the back of the jacket, catching the lining layer. Make sure to leave enough of the edge free so that you can still stitch the side seams. Lay the jacket front and back side seams right sides together. Pin and stitch together by machine, then trim down to around a 5/8 seam allowance or as wide as you can get without distorting the seam. Bespoke suit jackets are meant to last a lifetime and tend to have quite a bit of seam allowance left in them so they can grow with the owner. Once your seam allowances are all neat and trimmed, check the width of the lining seam allowances, then trim to an appropriate length and fold under to make a finished edge. The front side lining seam allowance then gets checked and trimmed down, then folded under so it overlaps the fold of the back lining. Slip stitch the two sides together. Do this to both sides and your lining is almost complete. Fold the jacket hem up and press into place. Trim the hem so it's even all the way across, then cross stitch the hem up. Cross stitches are taken up in the opposite direction of travel. This makes it a very spongy stitch with a lot of give, which makes it commonly used for hems. Now that the outer hem is done, we can put up the lining hem. Fold under the lining hem allowance so that it ends about 3/4 inch above the jacket hem. Baste the lining hem with a wide running stitch. The lining hem is then finished with a cross stitch hidden under the hem edge. Here I'm remarking the shoulder seam because my marks have faded a little bit. Take a strip of lining that's been cut on the grain and baste it into the shoulder seam, overlapping the seam line by about 1/4 inch into the seam allowance. Baste this end with a tailor's baste. Pin and stitch the back and front shoulder seams together, then trim the seam allowance down to about 1 inch. For the undercollar, I used flannel, but I really regretted that since it gets left as a raw edge and it ended up fraying quite a bit. I recommend using wool melton or some other felted wool. I just didn't have any in black, unfortunately, and I didn't want to wait to get the right material in. While the undercollar and canvas each get cut in 2 pieces and on the bias, the main collar fabric is cut in 1 piece on the straight of grain. The 2 underlayers are on the bias because it allows them to curve nicely over the slope of the neck and shoulders. Make sure to cut them using opposing biases rather than both on the same bias. This allows them to mirror each other instead of all wanting to shift to one side. The canvas layer gets overlapped at the center seam to reduce bulk, while the fabric undercollar can get seamed right sides together, pressed, and trimmed to about 1/4 inch. The canvas and undercollar are laid together and basted down the center along the roll line. Once the layers are basted, mark a circle with a 2-inch radius from the center back neck seam. This is where your pad stitching will start. Hold the collar into the desired shape as you start stitching. Holding it in this way will make sure it keeps its shape in the finished garment. Just like the previous pad stitching, go up one side first, then down the other, forming chevrons with the stitch lines. And basically just keep going until you filled the whole collar with pad stitching. This is the whole inner circle filled. Now to do the rest. Be careful not to go outside the seam allowance since this will be getting cut off later. When you get so far out that you're no longer making a complete circle, your stitches will follow curved lines more than a full half circle. Once I'm at that point, I just do all of one side, then do the other side rather than doing alternating lines on each side. We're almost to the end. Once you get near the end, make sure you're really folding the collar over a finger so the collar tip wants to hug near the body when it's done. If you're not careful about this, your collar tip might lean more away from the body, which isn't as nice looking. Hi, baby bat. So the point of the pad stitching is it's really well demonstrated in this collar because it's a smaller piece, but the point of the pad stitching is kind of to make it shaped as well as adding strength. So this was 2 flat pieces of fabric rolled together once, or just like put together once. And then after pad stitching, you can kind of see that it really doesn't want to stay flat anymore, and that's because I've held it in this rolled position while stitching it. So this side ends up with more area than this side, which kind of got squished to have less area as I was stitching it. With the iron, you can help the shape a little bit more with some scheming. I'm not hard pressing anything here, just smoothing out any distortions from handling it so much. You can kind of stand it up so it looks like the finished collar and wrap it around a press ham so you can steam it, then let it cool in that shape. This really helps in keeping the shape permanent in the memory of the fabric. Now that the collar is so shaped, the seam allowances may have shifted a bit, so double check those against your pattern, then trim them off entirely. The canvas seam allowance should be just a bit shorter than the fabric by about 1/8 of an inch. Match up the edge of the undercollar to the neck edge stitch line on the jacket. This will get pinned, then basted into place. To more permanently attach the two layers, cross-stitch the neck edge seam allowance to the canvas undercollar. Be careful not to go through to the fabric layer underneath. On the other side, a felling stitch is used to secure the edge of the collar to the jacket. Really quickly before I move on, I just wanted to check that both sides are symmetrical. If they're not, it would have been easier to fix it earlier, but it's still easier to fix it now than later. Thankfully mine was still okay. Place the canvas face down on the wrong side of the top collar and baste the two together on the roll line. Then baste along the top edge, making sure to roll the top collar around the curve and making sure it's not pulling or puckering. Trim the top edge of the top collar, leaving about 1/2 inch of seam allowance. Trim the sides, leaving 1 inch of seam allowance. Fold the seam allowance under and fell stitch to the undercollar. Fold the bottom of the collar seam allowance under and slip stitch into place. We can move on to the sleeves now. I'm using a stiff poly taffeta, which is super not the right fabric to use. However, it's the only thing I had on hand that was the right color and had a decent amount of body. Normally for suit lining, you'd use a light but stiff rayon. Suit sleeves are also typically lined in a striped fabric. Match up your sleeve seams and stitch together by machine. Suit sleeves get attached to their linings by stitching seam allowances together. Lay the outer sleeve on top of the lining, matching them up so they're mirrored. Pin the seam allowances together, then do a diagonal stitch. Pull the sleeve right side out. Or switch that, wrong side's out, oops. Fold down the seam allowance near the wrist, then baste with a large running stitch. Okay, so Yumeko's jacket has some cuffs kind of like on the bottom of the sleeve, well, not kind of, it has cuffs on the bottom of the sleeve. They're about the same width as these cuffs, so about 3 inches. So all I'm gonna do for that is I'm gonna trace off the bottom part of this pattern and extend it to the 3-inch mark, and then I'm going to add like 1/4 of an inch on all of the sides except for where it's marked at 3 inches, so that it is big enough to then go onto the sleeve, because if you just trace off the pattern of the sleeve directly, like it'll be the same size as the sleeve, so it'll look kind of sad and too stretched. Yeah, so that's the plan for this. Okay, now that the cuffs are made, we can attach them to the sleeves. Take one layer of the cuff and pin, right sides together, to the outer sleeve of the fabric. Trim and grade the seam allowances, then fold the seam up into the cuff and pin into place. Slip stitch the cuff to the sleeve. Cross stitch the lining into the sleeve, hiding the stitch behind the fold. Along the topmost edge of the sleeve, where it goes into the armscye, stitch 2 parallel gathering stitches. This can be done by machine, but I did it by hand since it's quick enough this way. Gather the sleeve up lightly and pin into the armscye, matching the top notch to the shoulder seam and back sleeve seam to the side back seam. Baste the sleeve in by hand, then stitch it by machine. It's easier to ease all the gathers in if you curve the sleeve over the body rather than the body over the sleeve cap. Press the seam allowance towards the sleeve. I had originally planned to add shoulder pads but couldn't find them and decided they were fine without. Pushing the seam allowance towards the sleeve helps add some volume there. Baste the body lining armscye to the seam allowance from the sleeve. So you probably noticed, but we skipped over the shoulder seam earlier. Fold under the front shoulder seam allowance, pin and slip stitch into place. Take the sleeve lining and fold the seam allowance under, encasing the exposed edges of the armscye seams. Pin into place and slip stitch the layers together. Most of the steps in this video are fold under, pin, and stitch into place. So jacket is basically done. My table is now a massive mess, so that's just kind of the casualties of this, I guess. I've got these buttons that I'm gonna stick on there, and I was gonna do handwork buttonholes with this thread that I got. It's like vintage thread from Etsy, but I'm kind of worried after working with this fabric so much that if I put buttonholes into this part of it, it's not fused, and I'm worried it's going to fray out really badly. So I think instead I'm going to do a kind of like quick change theater hack where I just sew the buttons to the outside, and then I'm going to sew hooks and eyes on the inside so they just kind of slide together by hooks and eyes, and it'll just look like there's buttons, but the buttons won't actually like be functional or anything. The cuffs also get buttons, but those were never going to be functional anyways, so it doesn't matter.